Unfortunately, no country is perfect, and Canada is no exception. In today's video, we explore a truly black spot in Canadian history. It's an event which involves racism, disease, and complete neglect. It is largely unknown or forgotten. Please join us as we learn about the sad story of the Leper Colony on British Columbia's Darcy Island. Though leprosy still occurs, it has been largely eradicated in the Western world. The disease plagued humanity for millennia until a cure was found in 1956. In Canada, leprosy is estimated to occur in 0.6 cases per 100,000 people, and worldwide, fewer than 1 million cases are registered annually. Leprosy, also known as Hansen's disease, is a serious long-term bacterial infection which can lead to damage to the nerves, respiratory tract, skin, and eyes. This nerve damage may result in a lack of the ability to feel pain, which can lead to the loss of parts of a person's extremities from repeated injuries or infection through unnoticed wounds. An infected person may also experience muscle weakness and poor eyesight. Leprosy symptoms may begin within 1 year, but for some people, symptoms may take up to 20 years or more to occur. Canada's first documented case of leprosy occurred in 1815 in the province of New Brunswick, but our story begins several decades later on the other side of the country. In the early 1880s, during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway, as many as 17,000 Chinese immigrants came to Canada to work as laborers. Many labor shortages in British Columbia and surrounding provinces threatened the economic viability of the country. Thus, as a way to bring the West economic efficiency, Chinese immigration was encouraged in the early 1880s. The arrival of the Chinese in Canada was partially the result of a demand for cheap labor in the West. Following the completion of the railway, the demand for Chinese immigration decreased significantly. Many of these immigrants found themselves unemployed and subjected to more and more racism. Anti-Chinese racism was exacerbated through Canadian laws like the 1885 Chinese head tax and 1923's Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese head tax was a fixed fee charged to each Chinese person entering Canada. The head tax was first levied after the Canadian Parliament passed the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, and it was meant to discourage Chinese people from entering Canada after the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The tax was abolished by the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, today known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which outright prevented all Chinese immigration, except for that of business people, clergy, students, and some others. The BC provincial government passed anti-Chinese legislation, which was disallowed by the federal government. But the demand was strong to restrict Chinese immigration, as most Chinese entered the country through Victoria. The federal government was caught between two forces. Employers wanted the Chinese, but the coastal BC population was strongly against them. So, while the federal government was reluctant to allow harsh anti-Chinese measures, they had no special reason to be concerned for their welfare. A notion popularized by stereotypical images and caricatures of the time represented Chinese Canadians as disease-ridden, unclean, and a threat to the health of others. When, in 1891, the Sanitary Commission for the City of Victoria discovered 5 individuals with leprosy hidden together in a shack behind a store in Chinatown, the municipal government immediately set to work quarantining them. Darcy Darcy Island is an 83-hectare island in Harrow Strait. It's the southernmost of the Gulf Islands situated between Vancouver Island and the British Columbia mainland, and it's in the Gulf Island National Park Reserve. For 15 years, this island served as Canada's most notorious leper colony, or lazaretto, and was known among the Chinese community in British Columbia as the Island of Death. In 1891, the original 5 lepers found in Victoria were taken into custody, and the municipal council requested use of the island from the government and set about making a lazaretto. Within weeks, the afflicted Chinese were sent to live alone in makeshift buildings on Darcy Island. At the start of their journey to Darcy, one of the men, obviously dreading his fate, jumped off the steamer as it left and tried to cut his own throat with a knife. From 1891 to 1906, all Chinese afflicted with leprosy were sent west to quarantine on Darcy Island, no matter where they came from in Canada. Sadly, the lepers' longevity was not a priority for the government. White leprosy patients, on the other hand, were sent to the Chocady Lazaretto in New Brunswick and were cared for by doctors and nuns. Dr. A.C. Smith, a leprosy expert who for 25 years had been superintendent of the New Brunswick Leper Colony, was asked to come to Victoria to examine the Chinese lepers and report on the prevalence of the disease in British Columbia. He summed up the situation as, "The 5 lepers in quarantine, unless they attempt to escape, will not require the consideration of the sanitary department for at least 12 months." Basically, the lepers were dropped off and abandoned on the island. Every 3 months, a boat brought Victoria's municipal health officer to the colony to leave food and clothing on the beach. The medical officer gave the lepers a cursory look along with some opium. An armed crew member stood guard to prevent the escape. Dr. Ernest Hannington of Victoria wrote circa 1898, "The wretched beings, some in the last stages of the disease, lined up on the beach and cried like children when we were leaving." The island was an ideal place to keep the afflicted, as the low water temperature and strong currents made it inescapable, though a few people tried unsuccessfully. But there was one who got away. A young wife came to the island in a boat and secreted her husband away in the woods for weeks until they ultimately disappeared. Completely isolated, left to fend for themselves and without any medical treatment, the lepers lived a monotonous life in buildings divided into small cell-like cabins. The cabins held a bed, stove, table, and possessions of the occupant. They cooked, slept, read, and did whatever they could to use up the time which separated them from death. As people died of the disease, other weakened sufferers had to drag out the bodies and bury them in the woods. Unbelievably, Dr. George H. Duncan, who is in charge of the station, is quoted as saying, "Just now, the best we can do is to isolate the poor sufferers for the protection of the public and make their few weeks or months here as comfortable as we can." The unspeakable suffering finally came to an end in 1905 when British Columbia received a share of the federal head tax money and improved the conditions at the leper colony. The Leprosy Act was passed by the federal government in 1906 and came into effect January 31, 1907. The act gave the federal government responsibility of the lazaretto on Darcy Island. It hired a guardian and interpreter for the colony and established weekly supplies of fresh meat, fish, fruit, and vegetables. In 1924, the remaining inhabitants were moved to Bentinck Island, thus bringing this shameful chapter of Canadian history to a close. Today, Darcy Island shows hints of its sorrowful past. Burial mounds and traces of trails, remains of gardens and orchards show how, despite their exile, the inhabitants suffering a horrible disease still work together to make their own community. Between 1891 and 1924, a total of 49 Chinese lepers were shipped to Darcy Island. 20 men were eventually deported back to China, and at least 18 died and were buried in unmarked graves. History, no matter how shameful and horrific, can never be taken away. We need to recognize it and learn from it, and more importantly, to never let it happen again. To read a first-hand account of the conditions of the Darcy Island leper colony, there will be a link in the description box. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, there are a few things you can do to help support our channel. Give it a thumbs up, share with your friends, and leave a comment. Let us know if there's a Canadian story you would like us to cover in a future episode. For more content about Canada, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell icon to be notified of our next video upload.